Good evening, and welcome to the first of our Food for Thought series for 2021. I'm very impressed at how prompt everybody is, and all settled in on time. Wonderful. I'd like first to start off by acknowledging and paying respects to the traditional owners of the land which I'm on this evening, the Ngunnawal people. It's upon their ancestral lands that the Australian Academy of Sciences is built. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning, and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. My name is TJ Higgins. I'm a Fellow of the Academy and one of the conveners of this series. Also joining me as convener is Dr. Emma Beckett, joining us tonight from the University of Newcastle on the Central Coast. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, TJ. I am delighted to be convening this tasty series with you. As some of you would be aware, due to COVID, we did have this series planned in 2020, but it was cancelled. But we are back with Food for Thought in 2021. So thank you to all of our series pass holders and attendees for their understanding and patience in these times. Thank you all for joining us at this first event that will take us on a delectable journey of taste, health, and food innovations. And tonight we'll be hearing about GM foods. I invite you to join the conversation through Twitter using the hashtag FoodThoughts21. That's FoodThoughts21 as digits. That was a hard one for me to say with a lisp. For those of you who are watching online, you can submit questions too by scanning the QR code that you'll see on your screen, or you will be able to click the link on the page where you're watching the stream from. And for those of you in the Shine Dome, you'll be able to ask questions live at the microphone during question time. Now I'll pass you back to TJ, who will get us started with GM foods.
Thanks, Emma. Before we get to our speakers, I'll just remind you again that this series is about food. I don't think you need much reminding about that. And this is a topic that I do a bit of reading around as well because of my own research activities. If I could have the first slide, please. Now, recently I was drawn to this book purely by its very witty cover. I don't usually pick books based on their covers, but this is one that I genuinely did pick based on the covers. I hope you'll enjoy as much as I do the cutlery handles on these implements. However, I should also say, apart from the commenting on the cutlery handles, I can say that this is much more than just a good cover. In fact, it is a very good book as well, and I'm recommending it. That's the end of the advertising. I'm not really advertising this book, but I enjoyed reading it very, very much, as well as enjoying the cover. But to get back to today's topic, I want to remind you that, if I could have on the next slide, please, that GM, it's also known as genetic engineering, or even as transgenics. And even though the concept of genetics is fairly recent in terms of time, inheritance has been known for millennia. Humans have been changing their livestock. Think of breeds of chickens or cattle, or dogs for that matter. Their ornamentals, think here of the vast variety of roses that are out there, or their crops, such as the members of the cabbage family, for instance, or different varieties of wheat. But the science behind heredity has really only been formally known about for 150 years or 160 years or so, since the time of Mendel, who described the hereditary factors involved in pea flower color and the height of the plants. The terms genetics and genes have been only with us for just over 100 years. So the science behind this is really relatively recent. But during that 100 years, the understanding of genetics has progressed very rapidly, and that knowledge has been used in changing the face of medicine and agriculture. One of the many advances in genetics was the discovery about 50 years ago that it was possible to combine sections of genes in the test tube and then transfer this, what is called recombinant DNA, back into a living organism. Those sections of genes could come from just about any source, even, for example, from microbes. This advance in genetics, unlike most other advances, and there have been very many, became very controversial, this one topic in genetics advances. The reasons for this are manifold, I would say, but included that it was unnatural. People thought of it as being unnatural because it went beyond using bees and the wind to transfer genes, but also because multinational companies in medicine or agriculture were considered to be in it only for the money. GM, like several other areas of science, became subject to a lot of misinformation, and rational discussion about risks and benefits became near impossible. My last slide, please. Tonight's speakers will address some of these issues. This cartoon here typifies a situation about many areas of science, not just about GM, but it is particularly noteworthy in GM. But to discuss some of these issues, risks and benefits, I'd like to first call on Dr. Surinder Singh. Surinder is a world-leading researcher in plant oil engineering. He's based at CSIRO here in Canberra, and he and his team have made several breakthroughs, including engineering canola so that it has the same oil profile as fish oil, creating a sustainable source of omega-3 oils. Please join me in welcoming Surinder. I won't thank him yet until he has delivered his talk. So welcome, Surinder.
Thank you very much, TJ. I hope everybody can hear me. So this is a real pleasure for me to talk about the work that me and my colleagues have done based over at CSIRO. What I want to do today is take you through a little food journey where we have actually in this journey used genetic modification to create crops and food that have better outcomes for the environment and also have better for your health. And I will present to you 3 snapshots along this journey. Next slide, please. Oh, previous one, sorry. Yeah, so the first story that I want to present to you is the omega-3 canola. So this is the work that I've been involved with, based at CSIRO, along with our partners, New Seed and the GRDC. So I want you to quickly define what is omega-3 canola. So when we're talking about omega-3 in this context, I'm talking about sorry, previous slide. Yeah, I'm talking about the long chain omega-3 fatty acids, as EPA, excuse me, EPA and DHA, which are normally associated with fish. And you're looking at a picture of a supplement that you might take. And why do people care about this? It's basically shown that it has beneficial attributes in cancer, brain development, Alzheimer, heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and there are many more along this side. So people do care about the EPA and DHA. And it is for that reason that you find that the fish oil has been incorporated in all of these foods that you see here that you can find in your supermarkets as well as in supplements. Because in this way people can have these important ingredients even when they're not eating fish. So I just want to now introduce to you where does these omega-3 fats come from. So basically the primary producer of the omega-3 EPA and DHA are the marine microalgae, which found in the oceans. And then the microalgae are eaten by smaller fish, and they are passed up along the food chain, and then you get into bigger fish like salmon, which we fish and eat, and get these omega-3 fatty acids in that way. Next slide, please. So, so where is the problem? Well, because of the climate change and impacts of overfishing, there is a reduced number of fish in the oceans, and also the popularity of salmon and people's desire to take a lot of these fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. There is a deficit of these fatty acids in the world. And the other thing that's impacting on this are the bit of the ocean pollution that you might be aware of, like the heavy metals and chemicals. So that also makes an impact. And you can see here from this global map that the areas that are in red and orange particularly are low in terms of the EPA and DHA that people living in these country, parts of the world are taking. And so then basically the Western diet is deficient in these omega-3 fatty acids, and so there is a desire to try and address that. Next slide, please. So I just want to take you through how are these fatty acids made, and it's a very simplified cartoon. Here is the microalgae, and it makes this primary fatty acid, which has got a single double bond in it and 18 carbons. And then basically what happens is there is a series of what we call as desaturations, which introduce a double bond, and elongations, which adds carbon atoms circled in red. So you go from a carbon with one double bond to a carbon fatty acid with 22 carbons and 6 double bonds, and that is your DHA. So this pathway exists in the algae. And what we did was that because the pathway exists in microalgae, in CSIRO, in Hobart, we had this big collection of living algae that we were able to go into and mine it for all of the genes in the pathway that convert or make EPA and DHA. And what we did, next slide please, was then take these genes and we were able to put them into canola, which is a very widely grown oilseed crop. And this is the part where genetic engineering comes in. And by putting it into canola, we were able to actually produce canola oil that has 12% DHA. Now 12% DHA, you say, what is that? That is exactly the amount present in fish oil. So this canola oil now contains the exact same amount of omega-3 that's found in fish oil and is equivalent to fish oil. And you can see the power of this technology that or this crop that we've developed. 2.5 million hectares of this crop that we have created can replace the entire global fish-sourced supply of DHA. So it is transformational in that regard. And what we've been doing, our commercial partners, they've been taking the oil and they've actually done extensive aquaculture trials, because this is a picture in Chile salmon being grown. So salmon absolutely need to be supplied with EPA and DHA. Currently, it's sourced from fish oils, but they actually substituted that with our DHA canola oil, and it was a great success. And just want to hit some highlights here that being a GM crop, it had to be approved by the regulators. So we have cultivation approvals and food regulatory approvals in Australia and Canada for this crop, and the cultivation approval has been achieved in the USA. Commercial production of the large-scale production to start anytime this year and into next year. They did a randomized double-blind human clinical trial with the DHA canola, and it was confirmed that for humans, it was an effective source of DHA, just as fish oil and fish oil supplements are. And they were also able to do their successful salmon feeding trials. 1 million adult salmon were fed the DHA canola oil, and they showed excellent health and growth attributes, as well as the EPA DHA profiles looked exactly like the fish. Next slide, please. So now I just change gears, and I'm going to talk about the work that Dr. Higgins and his team has done. And this is in collaboration with the USAID and Rockefeller Foundation. And this is the production of insect-resistant cowpea, very critical for Africa, countries in Africa. And why is cowpea important? Because it's a legume. It has high protein, low GI starch, global production of 75 million tons, fixes nitrogen, has high feed value, and is a very good staple food source for protein for people in Africa. But pests and diseases are a major problem, and that moth that you see there, that's the pod borer moth that lays eggs on the pod, which then release the larvae, which can actually attack the seed. And there's huge losses suffered. So Dr. Higgins and his colleagues actually, again, used the power of genetic modification engineering. They went to this bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, and from that they were able to, next slide please, able to isolate the gene that codes for this BT toxin, and that then when the larvae of the pod borer eats them, they basically die. Next slide, please. And then what they did was, using genetic modification, they were able to transfer the gene into cowpea and create a stable cowpea plant. Next slide, please. And you can see that two leaves here. One has been totally decimated. That's the non-transgenic or the wild type cowpea, gets eaten up by the moth. And on the right is the transgenic, which is completely resistant. Next slide, please. And this transgenic crop was developed by Dr. Higgins and his colleagues, and is being field trialed in Nigeria in 2015. And you can see that the non-transgenic, there are no pods, and so no grain. And the transgenic is full of grains. And on the right-hand side, you can see the quality of the grain, the 709A and 252D. These are the transgenic cowpea. You can see they're hardly touched, whereas the IT86D, that's the non-transformed or the wild type cowpea, which is totally decimated. So it was a big success, and you don't have to take my word for that. Next slide, please. And next one. So clearly that farmer was, very impressed. And I believe that the crop has been approved for commercial or rather growing in Nigeria, and it's slowly progressing through other parts of Africa. Next slide, please. So again, there are the two stories which crops have been created and they're out there. This is completely changing gears again, and I want to give you a speak of what's there in the future. And I want to show you the revolution that's going on currently in this area. Next slide, please. So what is driving this is basically this observation that animal-based food tend to have a very large carbon footprint. So on the top of this graph, you can see those skyscrapers. That's your beef, lamb, cheese, milk, dark chocolate, and so on. So there is a very large carbon footprint there. And then in the middle or the lower part of the curve, you see are the plants and the legumes. So this recognition has actually driven basically a new sort of revolution of how we might be producing food in the future. So next slide, please. And so what we call this revolution is, it basically is a precision fermentation boom. And what's shown here in this slide is that currently milk, for example, comes from cows, and it is a big cost to the environment of milk production from the cow, the methane emissions and water and so on. But on the right-hand side, you see these little baker's yeast. Everybody's familiar with baker's yeast. You might even use them in your kitchen. And you can use the yeast to basically produce milk. So the paradigm now that we might be shifting to is that you take the primary products from plants. At the moment, we feed it to the cow, and the cow converts them into milk. However, we can take the same primary components out of plants like sugars and feed it to the yeast, and then yeast are grown in fermentation vats and produce milk. And so what they've done is basically taken the same composition of milk proteins from cows, and also I'll show you the fats, and combine them through genetic engineering into yeast. And then when these yeast are grown, they basically produce something that is very similar to cow's milk. Next slide, please. And you can see that there has been a tremendous amount of interest in this fermentation-based food production. And you have the categories of meat. So this is plant-based meat. You might have heard of the Impossible Foods that is really going in great strides. So these are plant-based meats, and they produce certain components in yeast to give that meaty taste. Edible oils. So here, instead of using palm oil or coconut or such types of oils that have some carbon footprints and so on, we here at CSRO-backed company, which is Nourish, is actually making this in yeast. And then there's a company like, for example, Clara Foods, that is actually producing egg proteins and yolks in yeast as well. And then there's flavors and colors. So $435 million have been invested by venture capital in the basically 6 months in 2020. So I think that, what you might see that in your supermarkets in 10 years or something like that, more and more of these products with these company names appearing. You might already see some in the meat section. If you go, you might see plant-based meat products appearing already. And I believe that this might keep on expanding and growing. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So yes, so basically that's all I had to say along those 3 snapshots. And all it remains for me is to thank you for listening to me. And I would like to acknowledge that the omega-3 canola work was done by the Plant Oil Engineering Group at CSRO, Agriculture and Food here in Canberra. The BT copy work done by Dr. Higgins and his team are also based here at CSRO in Canberra. And I'd like to acknowledge Thomas Van Herk for the graphics and slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Surinder. We'd ask you to save your questions until the end, please. And I'd now like to introduce tonight's second speaker, and this is going to be virtually. Our second speaker is Professor Rachel Ankeny, who's joining us from Adelaide. She's an interdisciplinary, very well-known interdisciplinary researcher at the University of Adelaide, as I said. Her work intersects with bioethics, food studies, science policy, and the history and philosophy of science. Her own major ongoing project is called Organisms and Us, How Living Things Help Us Understand Our World. So you can see that she's a very good person for us to have comment on some of the things that you've already heard about tonight at the technology end. Professor Ankeny will talk about some of the other implications of this work that I alluded to earlier as well. So please join me in welcoming Rachel.
Thanks very much, TJ. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. My talk is going to be sort of the negative side, if you will, or at least raise some questions around the ways in which we understand GM food and how we might think about some of the implications coming off of the science that Surinder just explained. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Garner Land, which has never been seeded here in the Adelaide Plains, South Australia. So just to start, the way I want to frame my talk today is to talk to you about what makes good food. And I want to start with an anecdote. Some of you will have heard this. I've told this story before. Some of you may have been involved in this. Biotechnology Australia did a survey, and many people said they were opposed to GM food. But afterwards, as we often do in this research, they did focus groups. And in the focus groups, people said they would be willing to eat lamingtons that contain GM canola because canola is just junk food anyway. So it doesn't matter as much that it might contain something that's GM as opposed to fresh or whole, say, fruits and vegetables. And so this sort of, you can advance, raises the question, how should we think about this kind of conflict or this kind of perhaps even contradiction? You can advance, Tom, and advance again, and advance again. And what I want to say is that instead of saying people are just silly or stupid, to say not willing to eat a GM apple, willing to eat GM canola in the context of a lamington, we have to probe down and try to understand where these different views are coming from. And this also points to the deep issue that there's no simple answer, I think, about the way people understand GM food. So next slide. In particular, what I want to focus on tonight has to do with understanding what we call food values and the deeper values that relate to the way people make their food choices. My research group in Adelaide has done a bunch of different kinds of projects looking at the use of GM, but more generally, the use of choice and decision-making in food ethics, in particular, with concern to the kinds of technologies that are available, science and technology in the context of food. I think in the context of GM, what we see, you can hold, go back one, Tom, please, is that GM isn't really just or mainly about the technology. We need to really think about what are the range of factors that are associated with it, and in particular, think about ways that people can participate in the making of food policy around GM. And to do this, I want to really push this idea of food citizenship. Okay, next slide. Surinder did a good Tom, you can go to the next slide, please. Sorry, back. This is a bit tricky. Surinder did a good job here taking us through what GM is, but I always just like to give a really simple example of that. The key thing is that it's using lab techniques to alter living entities. And this involves removing a gene, changing function, perhaps inserting a gene. The key thing is to make it do something we want it to do, be it a plant or an animal, whatever else. And some key things have to do with nutritional yield and value, developing tolerance and having to use less chemicals, being able to deal with environmental conditions that are more extreme, particularly important here in Australia. Next slide. And so what we see in the context of all of this is that a number of crops have emerged more generally onto the scene, and they include, just going around quickly, rice, and that's golden rice on the right, up in the left corner, maize, soybeans, cotton, which you do consume some cotton in the context of cottonseed oil, and canola. Those are some of the main crops around the world. Many of them are also common here in Australia. So next slide. A bit of historical background, and I want to be clear, I'm not presenting this because I think this is the same as GM, but it's part of the broader context. We need to keep in mind that as humans, we've manipulated genomes for thousands of years using non-laboratory based techniques. And this includes simple things like domesticating animals and then continuing to breed them, or selectively breeding plants. And what's on the slide shows you, basically cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi are all very closely related and relatives of wild mustard. And they came about over time. Next slide. Another thing that isn't new is that commercialization of nature has gone on a very, very long time, and arguably goes back to the scientific revolution when knowledge began to be shared, documented, and even commercialized. So companies have sold seeds and sold plants for, again, many thousands of years. In addition, we've had this displacement of the native crops. Now, to be very clear, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a good outcome, nor am I saying just because it's gone on before that makes GM okay. But again, it's part of the background against which we need to consider people's concerns. Next slide. And finally, mutations aren't new. Mutagenesis and other kinds of scientific agents have been used to produce changes in organisms. And many varieties that exist today, particularly in plants, came about through those kinds of mutations. So just because you see something that's different or bigger or a different color doesn't necessarily mean that it's been genetically modified. It may have been developed using other sorts of techniques. Next slide. So some of the earliest true genetically modified organisms were tomatoes, and that's the kind of example many people tend to think about for a variety of reasons. One is that there was a synthetic gene that was put in that was similar to one found in winter flounder, a fish, and that sort of bringing together tomatoes with fish disturbs a lot of people, the cross-species kinds of genetic modification. In the end, it didn't really work. I mean, the goal was to protect tomatoes from frost damage, and it never really achieved what it was set out to achieve. There were tomatoes later that were GM, but many people found them, you might remember them, to be very tasteless. They were very fragile. They just weren't very nice. And so even though these were the earliest kinds of GM organisms, they really didn't do the work that people were hoping they'd do. So fast forward now, next slide, to some recent examples. What we see in the recent examples is there's quite a lot of, next slide, Tom, quite a lot of crops out there, and Australia is one of the players. You can see we're number 12, with cotton and canola as our two sort of biggest crops. But clearly the US, for instance, has a large number of crops and a large number of hectares. And you can go around the world and kind of see where the gaps are. Europe is a big gap, but also see there's quite a lot of these crops being grown. Next slide. The biggest kinds of crops that are being grown around the world, if you sum them all up, are soybeans at the top, maize or corn, cotton, and then wheat. So what do we know about what people think in other locales? Next slide, Tom. What we know about what goes on in other locales is that the opinions differ quite radically. Not surprisingly, given the uptake, Europeans don't tend to take GM food on board. We'll come back to some of the reasons why. In particular, there are certain traditions, both within farming and certain practices, but also attitudes towards safety and risk. The US, Canada, the South American countries, some places in Asia have large amounts of GM. And that relates to a whole range of things, including their underlying farming practices. The United States figures are perhaps the most striking. They have 600 times as many crops as are available in the EU, which is mostly limited to corn, Spain, and Portugal. So next slide. Here in Australia, we've done a series of qualitative research projects looking at Australian attitudes. And I just want to briefly take you through some of the reasons why people are for and against. So to start with why people are in favor of GM, there are hopes that it will help with world hunger, it will help with environmental issues, it may provide better crops for farmers in particular. In the animal domain, it may be better for animal welfare. Surinder went through some of the reasons why people think GM has great prospects. So in contrast, I want to then go through some of the reasons why people are opposed to GM. First, I want to say people aren't usually opposed in principle. They're opposed for really, really complex reasons, as the example at the beginning might have shown. I don't think the main issue is that they don't understand the science. They may well not understand the science. The main issue has to do with other values that people have that come to be associated with GM. Next slide. There are a small number of people, and I always like to acknowledge this argument and then set it aside, who think doing genetic modification is fundamentally doing something that goes beyond what we should do. It's unethical. And that flounder gene example that I told you about in tomatoes is a good one that people often cite. I think the number of people here in our research and otherwise are pretty small, because many people think using GM to create life-saving medicines and vaccines is a good thing. So it isn't that GM in principle is a problem. It has to do with ways in which GM is used. So let's talk about that for a minute. Next slide. A number of people who are opposed to GM really are concerned about the health risks. And they think, despite there having GMOs out there on the market in places like the US and Canada, there's still unacceptable and unknowable risks, both to humans and perhaps animals. And in particular, there's concerns about toxicity and allergenicity of GM products. A key example, and that's what the photos are from, are what's called bovine growth hormone, which was used in milk production, and many people protested it against for all sorts of reasons. Next slide. The next sort of set of concerns people bring up are risks to the environment. What you've got at the top is basically the corn at the top of the picture is genetically modified. The one below it is not genetically modified and has been eaten, infested by a certain kind of agricultural pest. And so the corn at the top is BT corn, which is a maize that's been modified using proteins from a bacteria. The BT protein is used actually in agriculture really widely, including in organic farming. But in the case of the corn, it's through a genetic modification that it's been put into the corn. This is the example you often hear people using because there's concerns about killing the larvae of butterflies that consume it, creating flow-on effects for the environment, and possibly creating organisms that can go beyond sort of their own natural boundaries. Next slide. In all of these cases, both around health and the environment, we have people saying, look, risks are just too high. And this is a lot of what the rhetoric in the EU is about. It goes along with what's called the precautionary principle. The idea here is that if there's any risk at all, we need to show that it is in fact not harmful before we use it. The burden of proof falls to those who want to use it. In short, what this means is we have to err on the side of caution, particularly where people are not convinced or there's uncertainty. And of course, people have different ideas about what counts as uncertainty. How many years do we need to test it? How long does the evidence need to go, and so on. This kind of principle, of course, has its critics. How can we ever then move ahead with scientific information or knowledge? GM crops have great potential, they would argue, economically, socially, and otherwise. For the global food supply, we need GM crops. So at a certain point, we need to say, we've tested enough. But the opponents want to say, look, the risks remain too high. And that's the crux of sort of the disagreement in Europe, and to a certain extent, the disagreements that we see here in Australia. Next slide. In short, then, this goes along with general views about food and the use of technology and science in food. Many people are concerned about risks and have different ideas about what counts as risky. A number of people in our research say things that come from nature are okay. Even food safety concerns perhaps aren't as risky for them than risks that come from us interfering or modifying nature, as we do in GM. Next slide. But more generally, what we see is genetic modification is of concern because it's in tension with a lot of these preferences that are emerging towards whole foods, natural foods, healthy and nutritious foods, and even foods that are free from additives. People see GM as an additive that's interfering with the ability of GM foods to be healthy or nutritious. And in particular, people are concerned about children developing and GM interfering with development. So it's these kinds of issues that really come up as the crux, particularly when the benefits are unclear. Next slide. At the root of a lot of people's concerns then are also the broader context within which GM occurs. And this has to do with the critique of the multinationals that are seen as controlling a lot of the GM crops in particular. And you probably have heard about debates in India and elsewhere and the effects on traditional farmers, where the big multinationals are seen as increasing their costs, not allowing them to do traditional things like seed saving, and they're not getting any benefits back from using the GM crops. In turn, then, activists see this as violating sort of fundamental human rights because they can't maintain their livelihoods. And a lot of people who participate in our research are saying, look, control over food is a right, and we really have problems with corporate or multinational control. All of this being said, a lot of food these days is controlled corporately or in a multinational context. So this is not particular to GM, but GM has become a flashpoint for these sorts of concerns. So next slide. What I think we need to take on for you be maybe too far left of center, too extreme, not accepting enough of the progress that science has made. What I want to say is that we do need to take seriously that their values make it difficult for them to make sense of what genetic modification can do for them. And in turn, it's going to be really important to engage people, part of what we're trying to do here tonight, in dialogue about what does it mean to have good food? What kind of food do we want here in Australia? Australia is an interesting moment because we don't have lots of GM food on our markets. Very different than, say, the US or Canada, or to a certain extent parts of South America, but nor do we have a completely restrictive regime in the way that lots of Europe does. So I want to encourage that we need to think through what are our real concerns here and what can the science tell us that might help mitigate some of those concerns. But more generally, what kind of food supply do we want? Next slide. To do this, I think we need to look beyond, are people willing to buy GM canola? Yes, people buy GM canola all the time. Are people willing to buy GM bananas or apples if we had them on the market, which we don't right now? That might be a bigger kind of issue, as I said at the beginning. Consumer discourses like that just look at what people buy, take us back to just individuals who are making decisions for a range of reasons, including the price point. Instead, we really need to think about what are we up to? What kind of policy do we want? How do we want to benefit from innovations, be it GM or otherwise, that could improve our food supply in different ways, could improve our environment in different ways? Food makes this kind of conflict between what do we buy as consumers and what we want for our society as citizens really, really obvious. Lots of domains do. Climate change, environmental issues, anything involving risk always brings these things to a head, as it were. Next slide. But what I want to encourage is that this domain will not have quick solutions. We really need to engage in long-term dialogue. Can't just think about this as about, should we have GM canola being grown in certain states? Should we shut down production of certain kinds of GM products? It's necessary to embed this in a broader kind of longitudinal perspective. As I mentioned, consumerism or neoliberalism is also not going to give us the answer, nor is simply educating people. I think what's important to see here is that people don't need to know every detail about the science to have an opinion or to be able to engage with what are the possible benefits of GM, but also what are the possible risks or concerns that they might have. So last slide, Tom. My takeaway tonight for you is to say, I don't want you to ask whether genetic modification is good or bad or wrong. It's much more complicated than that. And it's necessary to think about the context within which it's used. And in particular, what are the applications? What are the possible benefits? To whom? And in what form? Here in Australia, a lot of our research is collaborative between public and private entities. It's not all just about multinationals doing bad things. And I think that's where we open up sort of the dialogue to more creative kinds of projects in the GM space that could actually have considerable benefit, either for nutrition locally or globally, for the environment and otherwise. And it's necessary to put our public concerns in that kind of broad context and foster this kind of engagement around good food. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I would now like to invite Surinder and TJ back up to the stage for questioning the stream. If you're in the Shine Dome, you can make your way to the microphone, but please keep in mind that we do have our social distancing restrictions. While Surinder and TJ are getting into place, I might go ahead and ask the first question from our online viewers to you, Rachel. Rachel, how responsible do you think that the media is in the way they frame GM foods?
For the second one first. One lesson you need to keep in mind when you look at social media is that, and we've learned this year, I think maybe more than previously, it's not always coming from the same location. So you might see horror stories about GM being everywhere in the food supply, but that doesn't mean that's the case here in Australia. And that is important to disentangle, I think, because if you're trying to make the right sorts of decisions for yourself, which may be against or maybe pro, have people come to us saying they want to buy GM products because they think they can be good, you need to know the state of play here in Australia. There's good ways to do it. So social media, rife with conspiracy theories. You should only trust, those you actually know you can trust on issues. The media more generally, I think, some has been good and some has not been so good. Casting things in terms of Frankenstein or, things that are going to just go out of control, I don't think is helpful. I think there have been some thoughtful work in the media on the complexities around some of the newer techniques around gene editing, for example, in CRISPR. But we need more of that, where the details provided, but most importantly, the what does it mean to you is actually made clear.
We are also lucky to have experts like you to answer those questions today. TJ, I can't see the microphone. Do you have some questions in the room?
Not so far, but I'm hoping
that's okay.
People will
don't be shy, everybody. We're only doing questions till 7 o'clock, strict cutoff time. So if you're waiting for the warm up to happen, please don't wait. Surinder, I'll ask a question from the online questions for you then. There's a question about vegans. Can vegans be confident that if they're getting their omega-3s, their essential omega-3s from canola oil, Surinder, can they be confident that they're getting them in a form that can be biologically useful? And can they be confident that that's not breaching any of their vegan principles?
Yes, so that's a very good question. As I showed that the genes that we have taken to make, get canola to make the omega-3, they were sourced from microalgae, so which are lower forms of plants. So that's one point. So we haven't taken, for example, fish genes and put them into canola. So they're the microalgal lower plant genes going into canola. And the other question was, will the canola oil be efficacious in providing DHA, for example, if vegans were to take it? And there was that double-blind randomized trial done in Canada using the DHA canola oil and compared to fish oil. And the results of the study showed that the DHA canola oil performs just as well as the fish oil. And that study is now being written up for a peer-reviewed publication. So I think it will work.
Questions in the room, TJ?
No questions so far.
I will keep going then.
Yes, please do.
This question is again for Surinder. Congratulations on your exciting success stories. Do you think you're using the best microbial genes to produce the omega-3s, or is this an area that can still be improved? So that's a very scientific question.
Yeah, obviously. Look, science is a never-ending quest for discovery. So, there's no way to say that, well, what we've done is the final answer to making omega-3 in plants and in canola. Of course, there's a whole world of discovery that is happening, and I'm aware of that as well. And there could be other microbial genes that might be more better, more efficient, or more heat tolerant, for example, drought tolerant, etc. So yes, so we could keep our minds open about improvements.
Thanks, Emma. Could I have a question from the floor here now?
Please.
Barry?
Rachel, great talk. Traditionally, we've had a bifurcation between the environmental movement and the pro-GM movement. Do you think the pressures of climate change are going to shift that and bring a closer consensus with things like the example Surinder gave of the Impossible Burger?
I think that's a great question. I actually think it goes to kind of the previous, 2 questions ago. We're seeing alignments that we might not have predicted. So, often with veganism, we associate that with health concerns as well as ethical concerns. But vegans are finding some of these things very attractive. And so too, with I think, more clarity in society about the threat of climate change, it's going to be a very interesting domain for environmental groups to try to decide how they're going to position themselves. I think we haven't faced that yet because there have not been a lot of products on the market that have clear environmental benefits, GM products. But as we get closer and closer, and there are some drought-tolerant wheat, for example, that's been in the pipeline for quite a long while. There are some gene editing techniques for livestock, for trying to have livestock in hotter climates, and so on. We may well see that there needs to be sort of a merging of some of these things. I think there will remain some people who are going to still be opposed in principle, because of the involvement of multinationals. When it comes to animal welfare, many people are opposed to using animals in production, full stop. So less interest, even if it is going to be a gene that's going to enhance animal welfare. Talking about crops, that's where there's going to need to be some real deep discussions about trade-offs between risks and potential benefits.
Another question here.
Mine is more a comment, but for both of you to comment on, please. This is called Food for Thought, and GM foods are great, I think. But when we go into the supermarket and we pick up a product and we find that in Australia we're buying sweet potatoes from the US, potatoes from the Netherlands, products from all over the world, in this time of climate change, can we not get GM foods here in Australia for Australians? or any foods that we need, rather than this global transport of product that we want from all over the world, which is really adding in the food miles.
Yeah, so I'm happy to start, and then Surinder maybe can jump in. I mean, some of the products you named aren't GM, could we use GM to make some of those products here? I don't think GM versus not GM is really the issue. It has to do with people's expectations, and we want to eat everything out of season still. We want everything when we want it. And there's all sorts of things that would need to change kind of in our attitudes towards what we eat. I think generally Australia is pretty good about supporting local markets, but we need to just keep doing that more and more and more, and to tell the retailers that's what we want, right? Particularly the big retailers, given the duopoly. But GM is going to go some way toward certain kinds of crops being able to be grown, but not necessarily fix this problem that you rightly note of importing a lot of stuff and having a lot of food miles, which relates to the environmental question.
Surinder, could you comment on that?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to add to that. So clearly, in the consumer pull, our retailers respond to consumer pull. If they sense that there is a consumer pull for GM products that are currently, for example, being imported from overseas, be locally sourced, locally grown, and that acceptance was to come forth, then there's no reason why a genetically modified potato that doesn't go brown can't be grown in Australia, for example.
Go ahead.
Yes, good evening. Thank you all for the talks. One of the slides I noticed was about the carbon footprint, particularly of beef, which was up the top. I understand in Australia that our national herd has the lowest it's been in 2 decades. But if you go into a chemist or your supermarket, there's lots of whey protein that you can now buy on shelves, and lots of people taking protein supplements. So I'm just wondering, do you think this shift from natural sources that have an environmental impact to more convenient sources, is that being driven, do you think, by the consumer or by industry?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. What actually strikes me is that the bulk of the investment that's gone into this fermentation revolution, if you want to call it that, precision fermentation, it's come from VCs or venture capital funds, which generally you won't associate them to be concerned about environmental issues and things like that. However, what's recognized, I guess, it's the fact that the carbon footprint of some of the current food production systems is a little bit unsustainable going forward. And there will come a time where, this will not be a choice, but it'll be a choice forced upon us because of the way the climate has changed and the depletion of resources. So I think that it's good that that there has been some activity in this space for the food.
Rachel, did you want to speak on the industry versus?
Well, I was going to take it a little bit of a different direction. You might have better answers for this question actually than me, but I think there is this push towards food as medicine and seeing kind of these nutraceuticals, the aisles full of kind of powders and potions, right? But what I think about that is it's not just about convenience, is that people are seeking solutions that are more precise. They want to make sure that they're getting their nutrients and whatever else. And I think, again, that goes back more generally to people being nervous about how to cook. There's issues about sort of what's called culinary competency, how to know that they're getting the right things, and needing to fill out their diets with these kinds of nutraceuticals, if you will, or substitutes. And I think all of that always runs in tandem with these broader whole food products. So it's funny, I think that's often people trying to be more natural because they want to get, a fundamental access to a certain chemical or protein or vitamin, right? And so your natural is different than those people's natural. I think it's highly unnatural to do that, but I must say our household has a disagreement about this. So we have, some people who do take powders and potions and think that's a better way to access nutrients. So that's the kind of complexity I think is at the heart of kind of these debates over what makes food good.
We are pushing up against 7 o'clock in our finishing time. So TJ, if there's someone in the room with a quick question.
Yes. Colin Andrews. I'm a retired neurologist, so I have an interest in TGA regulation. My question goes to regulation. Can there be an authority developed that does the double-blind studies to reassure the public that the product is safe? And the second question goes to carbon. I'm a wheat and canola grower and a beef farmer and also produce wine, Jura wines. Agriculture's going through a carbon rethink, and now that beef can be given algae derivatives, the methane and the carbon produced is probably reduces by about 80%. And also with modern farming, we put carbon in the soil. So we're hoping in agriculture to become negative over the years. Could you make a comment?
Yes, I'm very aware of how agriculture is responding to, decrease the carbon footprint and the development of feeding algae to cattle to suppress methane suppressions, and that's a great development. So I think that there is a room for both. So, there's no way I'm saying that agriculture or beef production or dairy will totally be replaced by fermentation type technologies. But what will happen is that, there will be a niche for, what I was showing you in terms of fermentation, and it'll coexist alongside the dairy. Yeah, and the double-blind
answer the regulation question if you want.
Yeah.
There could be, and people have suggested that, but we went in a different direction quite long ago in this country. And the OGTR, uses sort of the basis of their regulation is what's called substantial equivalence. That would be a whole nother seminar. But, basically saying that the foods produced are not significantly different, and we don't do randomized controlled trials of food. So it also comes down to this difference between food and medicine and devices, right? But I think it's a super interesting, you're suggesting, I think implicitly, trust would be improved if there was an independent set of tests that went on over a long term and so on. And I think a lot of people would agree with you. It's just that the horse is kind of out of the gate already. So I think going back to a different scheme of regulation would be difficult and expensive. Not out of the question, but expensive and somewhat difficult. But great question.
My spies in the Shine Dome tell me we have one person waiting patiently at the microphone. So we will take that as the very last question. Please go ahead.
Right. So tonight we've been hearing a bit about the role of the private sector in genetically modified food and how the involvement of multinational corporations makes a lot of people uneasy or can lead to social issues. Do you think that genetically modified food production can be disentangled from this sort of influence from venture capital from multinational corporations, and do you think it should be?
I would say I think there's some good examples here in Australia. Sometimes when I give the talk, maybe sort of, I talk about the banana project in Queensland that was joined with local growers and was genetically modified and was collaborative through a linkage project, CSIRO, university, and literally the local banana cooperative. Those are the kind of examples I'd like to see. That being said, I do recognize that multinationals may be necessary when we're thinking about the global food supply. It's a question for me of how you regulate that, keep it transparent, and make sure there's benefit sharing. So there are advantages of multinationals if they're harnessed.
If I could just add to that, the project that Surinder talked about, the cowpea project, is totally in the public sector. There's no involvement at all of the private sector in that particular case. But yet, when we look at what's happening in Africa, there is still opposition to that, even though it is in the public sector. So I think it is much more complicated, as Rachel has said. It isn't enough to be just working in the public sector only. There is still an association with GM that says, well, okay, the Europeans won't accept it. So it doesn't matter how it's been produced. So thanks for the question. Very important one.
Okay, well, we are well past our finishing time now, so all that remains is for me to say thank you so much again to Surinder and Rachel for joining us tonight. Can we get a round of applause in the Shine Dome, please? I feel so powerful making that happen remotely.
Could I add to this a happy birthday to Rachel? I think it's Rachel's birthday today. So please wish Rachel a happy birthday.
Thank you for joining us on your birthday, Rachel. And we do also need to thank our event supporters, Gira Wines at Geostation and Hoberg Catering, that you all in the Shine Dome got to enjoy tonight. I'm very jealous that I was not there in person for that. Thank you to the Shine Dome team, and particularly the tech team, who allowed me to come to you live from Wonnarua country tonight, and Rachel from Adelaide as well. This amazing venue, did you know the Shine Dome actually is available for hire? So if you're interested, consider this iconic building for your next event. I'm very excited to know that and thinking about what I can organise there. Thank you again all for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again in June for our next talk, which is on gut health, and it features Dr. Wolfgang Marx and Dr. Claire O'Brien. Thank you again, and all have a very good night.